Hello, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming out tonight, albeit virtually. My name is Emily Russo, and I am the co-founder of Print a Bookstore here in Portland, Maine. Just a few housekeeping details before we start. If you have any questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat box at the bottom right or in the Q&A function, which is at the bottom bar of your Zoom window. If you'd like a copy of Hieroglyphics or Impersonation, I will include the link to the print page in the chat box. And now on to our speakers. Jill McCorkle has written 8 novels, including one of tonight's featured books, Hieroglyphics. And her work has appeared in the Best American Short Stories multiple times, as well as in the Norton Anthology of Short Fiction. She also has 4 short story collections. She is currently a faculty member of the Bennington College Writing Seminars and is affiliated with the MFA program at North Carolina State University. Heidi Pitlor is the author of The Birthdays and The Daylight Marriage. Her 3rd novel, Impersonation, was published earlier this month, in fact, just this past Tuesday. A former senior editor at Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, she has been the series editor for Best American Short Stories since 2007. Please join me in virtually welcoming Heidi Pitlor and Jill McCorkle.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Emily. Oh, I wish we were really in Portland, Maine. I would love to be there and in your store. So Heidi and I did a little arm wrestling to see who would read first, and we're each going to read briefly. It's such a great pleasure to get to read with Heidi tonight, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. My novel, Hieroglyphics, features 4 point of view characters, and I thought I would just read a little bit from one of the 4. She's the wife in an elderly couple, Lil, who is going through all of her old letters, notes, scraps, basically putting together what she plans for her children to someday read. She's more or less editing her life in some ways, making decisions about what they will and will not know. We all are haunted by something we did or didn't do, and the passing years either add to the weight or diminish it. Mine have diminished, perhaps because I've spent time thinking about it all. It might sound silly, but I see these bits and pieces as my contribution to evolution, the unearthing and dusting of the prints and markers that led me here. Some seem to bulldoze right through life and up to their headstones, but I want to take my time. I want to find the right words. I imagine my recipient to be you two, or perhaps your children, and I hope this is so, rather than some stranger who comes in and hoists old boxes into a dumpster or rakes away the remainders of my life like the sad debris in the aftermath of a flood or fire. I'll never get over the sight of what we left behind at our home of over 50 years to move down here. A mountain of cast-off things, old towels and linens, papers and books and shoes and pots, side tables and lamps, hoses and hose, packets of seeds I meant to plant, and a rubber squeak toy that had been safely hidden away in the back of my closet by one of the dogs long dead. And so much more, things not needed, things long forgotten, cans of cream of whatever soup and V8 juice, why, and peas that had sat there forgotten for years, and things that never should have been there in the first place, like tuna helper, or those things in my closet, like that geometric print mini dress I bought in the 60s, hoping to look like Petula Clark or Judy Carn, a perky pixie kind of dress that I never had the nerve to wear, and instead looked at it there at the back of the closet for years, along with a wiglet and a long frosted fall and some jackets with shoulders resembling a football player or Victorian monarch. We divided it all into goodwill, consignment, recycle, landfill, but there were also the things I couldn't let go of, letters, reminders, souvenirs, and I'm taking my time, relieved when I find something that might have gotten lost in that mountain of debris, like one of your drawings from first grade or the stub from a movie I'd forgotten I even saw, or a note from my father. When the moving van pulled away that afternoon and we got in the car and turned southward, the space within seemed so empty, vacant. Our suitcases and silver chest in the trunk, an overnight bag and thermos of coffee on the back seat, and I had that terrible feeling that I had forgotten something, because I was thinking of all the times the car was filled with you two, your belongings, your music and voices, the dogs, while going to school or on vacation or just to the grocery store, where I bought all those things that I then put on the shelf there in our dimly lit pantry on the red gingham contact paper I spent one snowy afternoon 40 years ago cutting and sticking in place, all those things that I put there and then forgot about. It's mysterious how fluid time has become for me. I wake and pour a glass and have no idea what I'll find. I'll stop there.
Oh, this is such a beautiful book, and it's such a treat to be able to read with Jill, you know, as the guest, as the series editor of Best American Short Stories. We have published you there, and I've been a fan for years. So
thank you.
This is just really a real treat for me. And this is such a beautiful book, and we'll talk about that after I read just a little bit. I'm just going to read from the beginning of my book. I don't think you need to know anything about it. I'm just going to start in. That's it. It's really easy. I once saw a woman in the library pick up a biography of Mother Teresa. A few seconds later, she returned it to its display, and next, she reached for a Kennedy nephew's memoir. The title, The House That Uncle Jack Built, was printed in a faux handwritten scrawl above the nephew's name, itself set in a bold Baskerville twice as large as the title. The book could have been called Why I Love Pants. It was the man's last name that would move copies. After eyeing the front and the back, the woman tucked her hair behind one ear and read the first page. I took the woman to be in her early 40s like me, dressed in athletic pants, a Fendi t-shirt, and salmon-colored sneakers. She may have just been summering here in the Berkshires. I stayed less than a pace away and tried to catch a glimpse of her reaction to the moment that Peter Kennedy, as a child, stuck his hand into the eternal flame, quote, immediately searing 3 fingers. A cemetery official marched over, called me a little brat, and ordered my whole party to leave, not knowing my relationship to the deceased, end quote. What ineffable quality made people want to keep reading a book after only a paragraph or two? At the time, I was reading a how-to book on teaching your baby to sleep. My goal was for my son and me to get more than 3 hours of rest without waking. I was also halfway through a book on the ins and outs of single parenting. In my arms, my son chose that moment to eject his pacifier and shriek in a manner both rhythmic and alarming in its goat-like tenor. The woman glanced up, and what she saw was a short, bleary-eyed person staring back at her, another woman with shoulder-length, unruly, reddish-graying hair, and an inconsolable baby dressed in a Red Sox t-shirt and a diaper. Cass had spit up on my jeans 10 minutes earlier, and the left leg was still wet where I had rinsed it in the bathroom. The woman's eyes went between me and my son while I tried to quiet him. I bobbed up and down and made pressurized wave noises in his ear, but to no avail. In order to give her some peace, I headed to the front lobby, at last reinserting my son's pacifier once I found it lodged in the neck of my hoodie. With Cass settled, I turned to see a librarian checking out the Kennedy book for the woman. I was pleased, nearly triumphant. She headed toward the entrance, where we now stood, and a man bypassed her, making her stumble against us. "Excuse me," I said, although it was she who had bumped into my son. "I hope you like that book. I hear it's good," I said. "I don't have my wallet on me," she said. She kept her eyes on my old flip-flops. "What?" I said. "I can't give you anything," she said. "What? No," I said. I laughed a little, so taken aback that I could not think of what to say next. She reached for her phone in her handbag and hurried out the door. I stood there with Cass in my arms. Had I not signed the non-disclosure agreement, I like to think that I would have asked her to please, in the future, try to avoid these snap judgments of people. Maybe I would have asked her to check her assumptions about class. I don't know. At the very least, I would inform her that I was the one who had written the book in her hands. So, Thank you.
I love that opening. And
Oh, thank you.
our people are really traveling the same path. It's so interesting, this journey, women, you know, women as individuals with their specific lives, but the greater path of womanhood in history. And I was so struck by a line you have when she's in the bathtub, where it's kind of the Calgon take me away moment, and
There are many.
and being nostalgic for that time in life when all the decisions are based purely on want. And
Right, right.
and of course, what changes all of that? But I mean, certainly parenthood. And
Well, right, and I had the same reaction to your book, and that kind of panic one feels at what you're leaving your children, and making sure it's good enough, and that feeling that you can never get on top of it, in a way, of what you're leaving your children and what you're making sure it's the right thing. And I almost wonder if women, well, feel it a little more acutely sometimes, but probably not. We'll just say no.
no, we'll just say parenthood.
Parenthood, that's better.
But there is that responsibility that comes in. But I'm so intrigued by this use of the ghostwriter, you know, and being the person behind the words. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about when that idea came to you. The opening is fantastic, and of course that moment for wanting to say,
well,
claim it.
yeah. Well, you know, I never get the beginnings right, and I think I never get the endings right. You know, the beginning and the tail end. I always sort of feel like it's a placeholder, and then I try a million different things, and then you know it when you get it. So this one, I just felt like it didn't want to start right in. I wanted to telegraph something, and I wanted to almost just give a little dip into here's what's coming, you know, and there's a lot going on in this book, and I wanted to jam them all right in the beginning. I wanted to get class, gender, who she is, her feelings, the craziness, and in a really quick way. And I kept trying it, and I kept kind of going too big with it, and I realized it was just a moment, and I work in libraries a lot, so it was really easy to imagine this. And then in terms of the ghostwriter, you know, that I think I was interested in kind of just a woman who's a real worker bee and behind the scenes, which is sort of what I am for Best American Short Stories in some senses, because I work with a big famous guest editor every year. It's very different than ghostwriting, and I'm lucky to have had wonderful guest editors who are not, it's not as complicated as it is in this book, but I really am interested in that dynamic, and how sometimes the power roles switch, and you never know who's, you know, the quieter person sometimes does have more power or more say, and you know, how that gets passed back and forth. And that's kind of how I entered this. I knew from the beginning she was going to be a ghostwriter, and I just thought that captured a lot of what I wanted to explore in this book, which were issues of gender, class, power, politics, all this stuff kind of.
Yeah, and there is that wonderful merge, you know, at the risk. I mean, I don't want to give things away, but it's just a really wonderful dovetail, you know, that.
Oh, thank you. Well, you know, not to keep bringing, you know, to play tennis here, but it does make me want to ask you, how did you come up with court stenographer? And did you have to do some research there? Because while they are different roles, there's a similar getting down the words and keeping one's own thoughts in and out, and you know, it was really interesting.
Well, I had to do a little research, because, you know, I grew up, my mother was a secretary, and so I was just completely enamored with the way she could write shorthand. And of course, I open a shorthand book and it just looks like chicken scratch. I mean, I couldn't tell you what anything is. And so I mean, I've read about, the mask where you can talk it in and the typing. And so I ended up, for ease in many ways, making my Shelley favor just old time, pen and paper, or the keyboard. And I was just thinking of all the different forms of language and communication we have that are dying out. I mean, my kids, when they were little, I mean, when they were the age I was when I learned cursive, they weren't writing in cursive, so for many, that's like a foreign language. And
Right.
so I sort of started off with my list of different ways of writing and what has to be deciphered in some way.
Right.
And likewise the objects that symbolize language, the objects that represent a story, and all those parts of our lives that if we don't explain it to someone, it will go unknown, So
I know it's interesting the kind of moment we're in right now. It feels like a real edge of the cliff where there's so much change happening, and you look at your children and you think, what, I don't even, what on earth is going to happen? How are we going to communicate? And I think that's a big part of both of our books that we were saying. What was I going to say? What I thought was interesting in your book, and it struck me as similar to mine. Some of my favorite moments were Shelley kind of saying, like, you get sort of inured to certain strange things in your job. So in my book, it would be, she'll to a client say, oh, she just said the word wonderful 4 times. I'm going to write that down. Or in your book, she's thinking, oh, it's the refrigerator. Always,
right.
Where do they put the body? What kind, is it a nice fridge? And then the kind of like, the most strange thing becomes mundane in language.
Yes.
And it's so interesting.
It is interesting. Well, I'm also just fascinated by how timely impersonation is. I mean, it is such an amazing time capsule of this period of time, stopping just shy of COVID. But you have gotten so much on the page that is, it's just wonderful that way. And the details of everything that's happened in these recent years. I always loved Updike's, many of those novels became that they really are kind of encyclopedias of the time with that kind of wonderful detail, which as a writer, I'm just so drawn to it. I think so much gets captured just by those specifics.
Right. We were sort of joking before we went on that in the paperback version, I could add in coronavirus and really bring it up. But I started this book. I mean, I think I sold it to Algonquin right before the election or the day after. It was right. So I was working on this before our president even announced that he was running. So it was very bizarre and confusing because it was sort of, I set out to write a book about issues that were problematic in our culture, but not nearly as problematic as they are right now. And then it felt like, well, how do you write it? I wanted to set, I didn't know when to set it. I didn't know what to put in there. And I would kind of take out details and put them back in. And I remember Kathy, our editor, we share a wonderful editor, saying to me, you have to put Me Too in. And I think I said something like that was like a month or 2 ago. And that was the weirdest thing because time has been moving so strangely and so much happens that I thought it's very hard to keep up. I don't want to, and you can't keep up. So at some point I just decided the end of the book would be the end of 2017. I would stop there. And because you do need an end point. You can't keep you know, the way that the world is changing, you can't keep up with it. And it's a
No.
real problem, I think, for writers now. How do you, you know,
Right.
who knows? I certainly didn't think, and you probably didn't either, that our readers would be sitting in a global pandemic reading our books.
Right.
So,
No, and it has all moved, you know, so quickly. But I think what's interesting in the movement within the novel, and it makes total sense, is that there's this all that's going on in the present. You have an incredible sense of humor.
oh, so do you. So do
Well,
you. Ellie. I mean,
just
thank you.
so many funny lines that just the social commentary so funny and sharp, and then the very gentle, tender mother-child moments, you know, and so I think these, here in the midst of the pandemic, we're all aware of the way time is passing and how, on, you know, it's perpetual Groundhog Day, but then in other ways, you know, so much is happening, and then we're in this slow motion kind of place that really has opened many of us up, I think, to you know, to looking backwards on certainly brighter days.
Absolutely. And, you know, I had this feeling when I was reading your book, it felt in this lovely way. It reminded me of someone who's in my book, Virginia Woolf, because it sort of comes in layers and waves. And there's almost a meditative quality. It's nonlinear. It's, it unfolds in this lovely way. And I read it too quickly, because I only got it, I think, last week. And I want to go reread it again, because it sort of demands, I love that about it. It sort of says, slow it down, turn off all the other crap, and read me, which is something that we're all, right now, I feel like I'm chasing my, you know, I've got the kids at home, we've got this and that and the other, and it's such an important thing to sort of say, slow down and move at the speed of a sentence.
Yes.
You know, not a story, but a sentence. I think it's really beautifully done. So
thank you for that. Well, you know, I think it really is a novel about memory, you know, which is not a linear thing. I mean, our memories work in a much more organic way. And so, you know, early on, I just had, well, again, Kathy Porras gets a mess of a draft, you know, just little bits and pieces, just everywhere. But it was a lot of fun putting, you know, sort of assembling it out of that, because, you know, and my catastrophic events are in the historical backdrop. You know, I have two characters who basically are the children of people who experienced the catastrophe, and, you know, each lost a parent to it. And so in many ways, I do think we're both writing about the generation of the children who have watched the grown-ups come through a difficult time. And you know, and so I was very aware of, in reading yours, the changing attitudes, and we're seeing it now, you know, with kids, just in terms of the conversations.
absolutely. And that sort of sense of, I think there's a word for it, a psychological term I'm not going to think about, but sort of inherited loss, inherited grief. And my character, Allie, lost her father when she was 2. So it's this sort of, it's almost a cross between imagination and grief for her, because she doesn't remember him. And I think that's a really interesting thing to dig into the rhythms of that, right, you know, where imagination and grief might overlap a little bit. So yeah, no, I thought you captured the rhythms of memory and memory loss really well, and that kind of having lost a parent myself who had dementia, it felt very real and there's something kind of beautiful in it as well as deeply sad. But there's something kind of, constantly orienting yourself and impressionistic in a way that is, you nailed it. So I'm not going to just sit here and fangirl, but I'm just fangirl sometimes.
Well, should we, I'm trying to see what kind of, are we supposed to open it to questions?
I think I forget what time they gave us until, I think do we have more time? Should we yammer on more or should we go to questions? 5 more minutes, they say. Okay, so I have a question for you.
Okay.
When you, you started answering this. I'm a really drafty, messy writer too. Maybe it's all Kathy's fault and that she just makes us all feel that way. No, I'm just kidding. But she's an amazing editor, but I always start somewhere different, very different from where I end with a book. And I was going to ask you, was this book always kind of nonlinear? Or it sounds like it was. It kind of came in scraps. And
yeah, it was, and the novel before it, in many ways, was
connected, so.
As well. No, I think, I had all the small parts, and what I really had to work on at the end was more the present timeline. I mean, I had in mind where everybody was going to be, Shelley with this trial going on, Harvey at school, Frank going back to see his boyhood home, Lil going through these papers. So I had them all in their places, but it was the logistics of how to do the very short present time frame so that when there were overlaps of information, that they worked or they didn't give away too much. And the one that I think I probably missed, but it works. Kathy will tell me, but it's I don't even know if we talked about it, but my little character Harvey, who's quite funny.
Yeah, who's wonderful, the little boy.
He's laughing about because somebody, this man was eating a poo-poo platter. And I have Harvey talking about, this before we get the scene where his mother, sort of tells the story where Harvey overhears it. So we've already heard him say it. But I think it's okay, I think
it's okay. It's a nonlinear book. It's,
But, it's the kind of thing you notice, but I mean, you can only keep so much in your head, right?
You really can. It gets harder and harder. And one final thing I was going to say too that I loved about your book that I tried to do in my book was to, not have the kind of silent child character, to have a child with a personality. I think it's so important that children are characters too. They're people, and they can be funny and weird and, smart and dumb, just like, and I love that about Harvey. I just thought.
Well, and Cass also is a real kid. And, yeah, I mean, I respond to children who don't behave like children the same way I do the fake Southern accent that makes me just.
It's horrible. I know. You just want to say stop. Go rub mud on
Don't do that. Don't do that.
Yeah,
but,
stop it.
No, because I really do think. And I've said this a million times, but children, both in life and on the page, they're just so pure.
Yeah.
And the honesty,
right.
And the quirky, the way their minds just bounce from one thing to another, and so it's also fun, I think, to have a kid on the page.
It's really fun. And I think there's something that you try to do as a writer, which I always sort of feel like our job is to land on planet Earth as an alien and report back to the alien group what this looks like. And this is going to come out wrong, but children are very useful for that, for looking at something cleanly the first time.
Absolutely.
And using language that we might not use as adults, using alien language.
Yeah, but it's true. And looking, so often looking with absolute horror at things that we may have become immune or desensitized about, you know, and suddenly you see a child respond, and that's the real response.
Absolutely. Yeah. I know. I think it is funny that we both have single moms with young sons in our books. Was it that way the whole time? Was it ever a little girl, or was she ever?
No, Harvey was always Harvey.
I love his name. Harvey too is just perfect for a boy. It's just wonderful.
Well, and I named him before the Me Too movement.
Oh, yeah. You know what? I didn't even think about that. It just seemed like a sweet man. It didn't seem that I didn't.
Yeah, because I had not heard of a Harvey. No, I think we have so many overlaps. We have the single parent raising a child. We have, you know, the discussion of a missing parent and the effect, the power of the written word, and sort of the image that words cast out into the world, whether it's exactly right or not. And even at one point, and this is when I was sort of doing my mental list, but at one point you have the little phrase, never apologize. And I have Shelley's brother telling her, you know, so it's something Shelley is like saying, never apologize. And I thought, this too is part of that journey of womanhood.
Absolutely.
You know, that it's not, oh, I'm sorry. You know, this whole, anyway, it was fascinating to me what's in the air, because the novels are very different novels, and yet we're really, you know, walking this planet as cousins.
Yes, exactly. I know. I love it. It's like visiting your cool cousin who lives in some very cool different place.
Yes.
Oh, there we go.
Hello. I know I could let this go on for hours, and I wish we could. We do have some audience questions coming in. I'll do the first one from someone who is near and dear to you both, Kathy Porras, who asks, now that you have both done quite a few Zooms and you have quite a few under your belt, how has this changed the book release experience?
You go first, because you've been out there longer than I have.
Well, it's a very different experience, but I have to say I'm more and more at the end of the day feel like I've really been somewhere and seen people, and it's feeling really good. And then you say goodbye and you turn around and you're in your own house and you can sleep in your own bed. And that's the good news. But also, you know, what I miss about the other kind of book tour is the physical connect, you know, to be in these wonderful bookstores, to meet people in person. And I've always found book tour as kind of a legitimate free head time, you know, when you were just sort of out traveling around and in your head in a way that you don't always get to be in normal life when things are going on. So that's the difference, I think.
Mm-hmm.
It's strange. I mean, you know, it is at once more intimate because you are sitting in your house, you know, you're closer to people. There's something, you know, I think I wear more makeup, I want to say, you know, than I would on book tour, because you're standing in, you know, it's just an odd thing. You're being seen and you're not seeing. the people, and I really miss the faces. I miss, there is a certain feedback that happens when you're reading. You look up and people are kind of like, all right, and then you know you're done, and you know, and I really love talking to readers. I love hearing their stories, and it's a bummer not to be able to get that. But it also feels like this is more accessible to more people, and which I like. It's more accessible to me. I can, you know, my kids are downstairs, my dog's over there. You know, it's crazy multitasking, but it is incredibly different, and it's a little bit scary because it just feels like you're shooting your book out into some strange new world that hasn't been figured out yet, and you just hope that it sort of does okay and that we all do okay. But yeah, it's strange.
It is strange. And I would really love to be in Maine, especially this time of year.
It is beautiful. It is beautiful up here. Although we had a torrential downpour about an hour ago that was threatening to cut off my power at the house. So I prayed to the event gods to keep power running, and the event gods blessed me. So
such a great city. That's
yeah,
beautiful.
It is.
All right, got a couple more coming in here. Actually, for both of you, both Jill in your capacity as a prominent short story writer, but also Heidi, because of your experience editing Best American Short Stories. How do you think, or how does thinking about the arc of the short story collection differ from the arc of the novel, or short stories in general?
Oh, Heidi, you want to start with
I mean, you know, so I just write novels and work with short stories. I'm a weirdo. So, you know, it's a different pace. I think you read stories, you know, a story is between a poem and a novel. So you read it more slowly, I think, than you would read a novel. I was going to ask Jill a question, but I'll blab for a little longer, then ask you my question about stories. In terms of a story collection, I think it's just a completely different beast. It's, you know, I love both. I always say, I don't know that I care about what form it comes in. I just love great writing, and writing that I respond to, whether it's poetry, nonfiction, weird hybrids. You know, I long ago stopped sort of saying, I only like this and I like that. And people who say that kind of bug me, because I do hear a lot of, I don't like short stories. And people say that to me all the time. And I say, and now I've learned to just nod and say, okay, thank you. I don't, you know, I don't tell them off anymore. But I don't know. They're just such different beasts, but good writing is good writing, and a good story can be delivered in a million different ways. I think that's all I'm going to say. But my one question with Jill is this: do you know that what you're writing is going to be a story or a novel, or does it ever change?
You know, I've gotten a little bit better at it over the years, but I still have, just like my character Shelley. You know, at one time I wasn't sure. I was thinking Shelley might be her own story. Like I had done the whole, you know, refrigerator, you know, and then, you know, oftentimes it's a story that never really takes off or goes, and you plug these characters in and they work in the bigger platform. So oftentimes that's how it works. But more and more, I recognize the idea for a short story, because just as you say, I mean, I think the story is more kin to the poem than a novel. I am not a poet myself, but I greatly admire poets, and I read a lot of poetry, and I get great satisfaction from reading short stories because I can see it all, and really, you know, feel that the impact at the end. I love, you know, you get it all in one bite, which is very satisfying. But I think, you know, if the question was about the arc of a collection, I do think it's interesting when people are putting short stories together in a collection, to, you know, because sometimes they're linked or thematically connected. The advice I've always heard is, you know, to think of it as like support beams, you know, so you lead strong, end strong, and put one in the center. And so I've organized that way. But I've also found over the years that when I often work on a lot of stories sketched out at one time, and I tend to hoard them. I kind of I work on stories in a very similar way to the way I work on a novel. And so I will have several stories in rough draft, and then I start revising. And then finally, I just take one off to the side. And, but what I've learned starts to happen when you work that way is thematically, they start to sing back and forth the same way the characters of a novel would. And that's been kind of interesting, because then there's like a natural arc somehow.
Right, another question from the audience. Thomas Wolfe was famous for using people in his life whom he described in his novels. Do y'all have folks who recognize themselves in your novels and stories?
Heidi, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, you know, my father, who has passed away a couple of years ago, had a brother who also passed away, and the two of them always found themselves in everything, and they were not these people, but they, you know, the slightest whiff of everything, they were happy to take credit, and I was happy to give them credit even if it wasn't due. Do people recognize themselves? Not really. I think there's, you know, I've had some people ask or think they recognize people, but I work hard to not, you know, I don't take people directly from my life. There's little smudges and slivers of people, but for the most part, I try to really fictionalize my characters. And
I do too. I work very hard, you know, to push back. And I often tell students who are worried about this that, you know, you get the emotional truth down and you can make all kinds of changes. I mean, it's kind of shocking the changes you can make and not lose the story if you've really tapped into it emotionally. But no, you certainly get a lot of questions. I was laughing because I always think I've heard the writer Lee Smith, wonderful writer, who has often said that if you describe someone accurately enough, they won't recognize themselves. Now,
oh, that is great.
I'm not betting on it, you know. I'm not testing it. But anyways, it's very funny. And then years ago, I decided that the answer to that question, you know, when somebody says, "Now, did you mean for so and so to be so and so?" I learned that the correct answer is no, but it's so interesting you see that. What made you think that?
Put it back on them.
Yeah, it says more about them than it does.
It's the grown-up version of rubber and glue.
Yeah. All right, we got a couple more minutes. One of my favorite questions to ask. Who are you reading now, and what is your favorite underappreciated novel?
Oh, God.
The two questions.
Oh, wow. Ooh.
Oh, I'm not going to remember. I don't have a brain. Wait, let me think of it. Okay. Jill, you go first.
Well, I have been reading, other than Heidi Pitlor, I have been reading Natasha Trethewey's memoir, Memorial Drive, which is really wonderful. And I have on my stash Margot Livesey's Boy in the Field, which I am very excited about, and the new Randall Keenan short story collection, which I recently read, If I Had Two Wings.
And Heidi,
And
we
what
can
about
change
the
it to,
underappreciated novel? Do you have the most under?
You know, I'm having to think on that.
or maybe most underappreciated author. We can make it a little bit broader.
Think
I mean,
on that, and
you mentioned
I'll
Lee Smith, who I think is certainly underappreciated.
who?
Lee
What?
Smith. Jill mentioned Lee Smith. I think she,
Yeah.
at least maybe further north, but I feel like Lee
Yeah,
Smith is
further
the
north.
name that doesn't
Lee
come.
Smith and a former, and a former Algonquin, right? Two, in fact, Buddy Norden, Lewis Norden, and Larry Brown, I would name.
Yeah, those are good ones. I did just finish today Hieroglyphics, which is wonderful, and everyone should buy it and read it. Margot Livesey is up next for me too. I think that looks really good, and she's such a wonderful, precise, mysterious writer, and an old teacher of mine, but just so smart in so many ways. Emma Klein's new story collection called Daddy is incredible. I want to read the new Kylie Reed, which is called Such a Fun Age. I think that looks really good. For underappreciated, I am going to go with someone who has been long dead. Her name is Nancy Hale, and I think Penguin Books or something re-released a book of her stories that Lauren Groff wrote the foreword to, but she's a completely forgotten writer who never should have been forgotten. A really wonderful short story writer who was just so ahead of her time, kind of oh my God, I'm going to forget her name. She reminds me of someone else who I'm forgetting because it's been a long week, but Nancy Hale, she's worth taking a look at.
And I'm going to add to it now that my brain gears have engaged, the wonderful writer Michael Parker, whose last novel, Prairie Fever, is absolutely beautiful. Speaking of language. So.
All right, I think we have time for one final question. Do you have any creative hobbies or outlets that you find assists you in your writing?
I do. I have doll houses. And I have been, let's see if we can show them. I built that.
Oh my gosh, Jill. Those are beautiful.
Thank you. I didn't do it like recently. Like the first one I built when I was 30. And so it's just kind of always a work in progress, kind of like a novel. It's very similar to a novel, actually.
It's absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah. You know, I don't have anything consistent. I've done everything from reupholster furniture to draw poorly to mess around with sculpting and clay. I think it's really great to work with your hands after working in your head. Mm-hmm. So anything where I'm, that sensory and feeling, I really enjoy that. But yes. I just seem to be busy lately. I miss that feeling.
Well, here is a great idea for a holiday gift. Here is an F-bomb. And I have the pattern, the crochet pattern.
Oh my God, I love that.
This was a gift. And I love it. I would always take it to school, but I do have the pattern now if you want me to share it.
You know what? I did just start crocheting. We did one thing with my daughter. We did big thing like that big nubby yarn that almost looks like a rope. We started doing that during quarantine, which was really fun. So yeah, for people with no artsy craftsy talent like myself, it was perfect because it required none. So.
No, I love crochet because you don't have to do all the counting. You can keep talking and not pay attention, or watch.
The F-bomb is perfect for our time.
I mean, I'm a terrible knitter because I just.
Me too.
All right. Well, thank you both so much for being here virtually, and thank you all for coming out tonight to watch this event. Have a wonderful weekend, and thanks again, everyone.
Thank
Thank you.
you, Emily. And thank you, Heidi.
Bye.
And bye.
Good night, all.
Thanks for coming. Bye.